lot because I don't know I'm so ignorant about such things, I just don't know what people actually think. And so you can't begin to address a question like that till you find out why those who stand in opposition to your claims, let's say, why they think the way they think. Now, the probability that there's no tradition, say within Indian families, that approximates free speech in flourishing families, it's like, that's zero. Because it's not possible, and if it's just a tyranny, if it's a tyranny, well, tyrannies aren't sustainable. Chimps can't even sustain tyrannies. And I'm saying that for technical reasons, because there is this idea that's quite promoted that complex animals like chimpanzees live in dominance hierarchies, and it's the meanest, toughest male chimp that rules the hierarchy, right? And he's like Stalin, except in chimp form, which actually places him somewhat higher on the evolutionary scale than Stalin. And so, but Frans de Waal has investigated the structure of those societies in great detail, and it's simply not the case that the most tyrannical chimp is on top. In fact, the chimp males who sustain leadership across reasonable amounts of time are unbelievably reciprocal in their interactions, especially with other males, but they're also particularly attentive to the females and the infants. And part of the reason for that is, well, let's say you're, Joe Brute chimp and you're strutting around like a fullback and in Georgia constantly showing off your physical prowess. It's like, well, one day you're a little sick or a little tired and two chimps that you've tyrannized will tear you into pieces. And that happens quite frequently in chimpanzee disputes where a too tyrannical male will be literally torn to pieces because chimps are very brutal when they get their mind to it. And they're just taken out. And so there's a principle of reciprocal altruism, let's say, that's associated with the free exchange of ideas, and something like mutual valuation, and that's recognition of the soul, I would say, on a metaphysical level, that's a precondition for peace everywhere, not just in the West. And that's been propositionalized and formalized into law in different ways in different cultures, and sometimes not formalized so much yet, let's say, because many cultures are governed primarily by ritual and custom rather than, a fully articulated body of laws. But the fact that does not mean by any stretch of the imagination that English common law is somehow purely arbitrary social construction. It's like that's it's a preposterous claim. So I would start by listening and find out exactly what the issues are, and then proceed from there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Peterson, for what you've given us this evening. You've spoken now in a very complimentary way about English common law, and I'm very pleased to hear it. But freedom of speech is something novel, largely, in our civilization. You just have to think about how dissenters and Catholics were treated in this country not too long ago. You couldn't go to this institution if you were not a communicant of the Anglican Church. I'm not an Anglican, but I sympathize with them, because if you've got something good, you want coercive and directive measures to protect that thing. And in fact, you might be committing a very serious injustice if you don't put the context and structure in place to prevent people who want to repudiate that good thing from invading and corrupting what has taken so long to put together.
Spoken like a true conservative. and that's not ironic or denigrating. I mean, yes, absolutely.
So how do you reconcile that?
Well, there is no permanent reconciliation of that conundrum, right? Because, and I've traced the development of that paradox back, as far as I'm concerned, back into Mesopotamia, passed through Egypt. The Egyptians had two primary fundamental male gods, and one of them was Osiris. And Osiris was the founder of the Egyptian state, mythologically speaking, kind of like George Washington. But he was also the spirit of stone. And so he was the representation of conservative order. That's a good way of thinking about it. But the Egyptians portrayed him as old and willfully blind, specifically willfully blind, which is extremely interesting, and subject as a consequence of his willful blindness to the evil machinations of Set. And the sun sets, and so that's how you know the Egyptians thought about the sun and Set. And so Set was the evil uncle, essentially, and he cuts Osiris up into his pieces, which were also, by the way, the provinces of the Egyptian state, and sentences him to the underworld, and then rules in his stead. That's the danger of an unthinking conservatism, because all our cognitive and social structures deteriorate with the passage of time, because time changes all things. And so we're always fighting to maintain what we have, and that includes our categories of perception themselves in the face of a continual onslaught of novelty at virtually every level of analysis. While the second god of the Egyptians, this is a very cursory overview, obviously, was Horus. And Horus was the son of he was the rightful son of the true king, raised outside Egypt, and alienated in some sense from the tradition that gave rise to him. But he was simultaneously the falcon and the Egyptian eye, that famous Egyptian eye, that open eye. So he was the god of attention. And his mother is Isis, and she's the chaos that arises when order disintegrates, gives rise to the hero. Horus goes to the underworld to rescue his father. And the Egyptians conceptualized the soul of the pharaoh, so that would be the proper source of sovereignty itself, as the union of Osiris and Horus, the living union of Osiris and Horus. So they would celebrate the pharaoh like you do when a new king is crowned in the aftermath of the death of a reigning monarch. The king is dead, long live the king, right? The kingship passes, and that's Osiris. The tradition passes, but the tradition has to be living. It has to be allied with attention. And the Mesopotamians put a modification on that, which was also magic speech. So tradition always has to be allied with attention. And it's like, you know this is true if you own a house, especially if it's an older house. Well, the four walls are there and they're necessary, and you want to protect and preserve them. But you have to maintain them. And sometimes you have to replace them. And how do you tell? And the answer is with a careful and judicious eye, with some humility and gratitude for what you already have, but with some understanding that in the face of continual transformation, some change is necessary. And then you might ask, well, how do you decide when change is necessary? And the answer is by engaging in political dialogue mediated by free speech. That is literally